So the second thing we want to talk about in terms of who is likely to win election, or in this case, re-election, is the idea of the power of incumbency. An incumbent is an individual who is already in office and they're seeking re-election. And what we find in our political system, and you can see on that, the people who are already in office have a really, 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 really good chance of getting re-elected. And so that would suggest, as we talked about a little bit earlier, should suggest that we're happy with the situation. It is an indication of things are going great, keep on trucking, y'all, we're going to re-elect you. I remember the House of Representatives, 2 years, comes back to us and says, how's it going? How am I doing? And we're like, you're doing great, we'll re-elect you. Or the U.S. Senate will come to you and they'll say, well, there's some things differently, but over the 6 years, I think you've done a great job, so yes, we'll re-elect you. That's the idea behind this high incumbency rate. You'd think would be behind it, but in many ways, it's not the case. And so I want to lay that out before we get into some of the numbers. The numbers are pretty stark and pretty overwhelming in terms of proving this idea that we get incumbents despite the fact that we really would like actually new people and a different Congress and different members of Congress than we're getting. Some of this we'll talk a little bit more specifically in the chapter on Congress, because a lot of this has an influence in terms of how Congress does what it does. Furthermore, because we're talking about the ways in which incumbents are able to use their position in Congress to make it easier to get reelected, we're going to talk about that in the Congress chapter, both of which, both this chapter and the Congress chapter, are covered on this next exam. But in terms of the answer of why incumbents win is not going to be a complete one until we take a look at the chapter and the lectures for chapter 11 on Congress. So, but as an overview, there's indication that we're really not happy with this system that we have, because if you take a look at from public opinion polls, they'll be asked, do you support your member of Congress? And so this was done, it's done regularly, but in March of 2019, the support for Congress as an institution was 23% of Americans say that Congress is doing a good or excellent job. And that's an overwhelming majority. My math is not that great, but that's an overwhelming majority of saying that it's not doing a good or excellent job. And if we have this idea of legislative supremacy, that is an indication and an indictment on our entire political system if Congress isn't really liked by we the people. But some people argue, well, okay, you might not like what Congress is doing, but do you like your actual member of Congress? And when we take a look at that, only 28% of Americans say that they like their member of Congress and say that they're good or excellent. And so again, that's an overwhelming majority in terms of popular sovereignty who do not like their individual member of Congress. They don't like the institution, they don't like them working together, and they don't like their individual member of Congress. And it is that one that would suggest that if you're not liked, why do they get reelected at such high levels? And part of it is, and we'll talk specifically about this when we talk about Congress, is that it is on 43%, a minority, who believe that their member is in touch with their district. And part of the argument is that people, when they were worried about the way in which Congress does its job, they were saying, well, it might not be good for the country, but one thing that the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate can do is deliver goodies to your particular district or to your particular state. And so, in that sense, even if it didn't lead to good outcomes, it might have led to at least good things for your district or good things for your state. But even that, a majority of Americans, 57%, say that their member of Congress is not in touch with their district. And so it seems unlikely that people disliked would get reelected. And yet, when we take a look at the numbers on the next part of the slide, we can see that they get reelected at incredibly high rates. So when you take a look at the House of Representatives, from 2004 until 2018, the average percentage chance that an incumbent will get reelected is 93.4%. That's a strong A that they have. Take a look over time. Some, it was near 100%. In 2018, it was 91%. In 2016, 97% in 2014, 90% in 2012. In 2010, the worst time House of Representatives was 86% incumbency rate. For the U.S. Senate, the average is a little bit lower. It's 88.3%. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the differences between the Senate and the House. It actually does make some sense. And there, taking a look at specific dates, you have 2018 was 84%, 93% in 2016, 95%, 91% in 2012. And you see that in 2006, the lowest rate of income. So it's even so, that is really good job security, and you guys will recognize and be very jealous of this level of job security that elected officials have. Because in the modern society, the gig economy and things like that, it's unlikely for people to hold on to their jobs for as long as members of Congress are able to do. Um, and so these numbers, these aggregate numbers, point out that there is a huge gap. We're not happy with what Congress is doing, and yet they're getting reelected at these very high. And what we also see is that even in those periods, like the 2018 elections, the midterm elections of 2018, which had the highest voter turnout for a midterm election in a century, led to a bunch of people coming into the political process because they were energized by, truly because of the action and the reactions of groups against Trump. It led a lot of people to get interested in this and to participate. Perhaps not want more people participating, but you did have huge voter turnout, at least compared to other midterm elections. But even in that one, and you would think that the reason why so many people are energized is they would want to have something new ideas, new people representing. And there were a lot of people who became members of the House or the Senate for the first time. But it's not because they defeated incumbents. In many ways, it's because the incumbents decided not to run for re-election. Any incumbent that decided to run for re-election had a really good chance. And so we saw in 2018, incumbents had a 91% success rate, and in the U.S. Senate was 84%. That even in elections like that, you have an incredibly big. And so on the next slide, we want to talk about why that happens. And again, the answer is not complete here until we go to the next chapter. Let's lay out the main points now, and then when we talk about Congress, we'll get some of the details in there. The first one is that Congress is basically set up to get their members reelected, particularly through the committee assignments. That the committees that members of the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate sit on are ones that allow them as a mechanism whereby they can actually deliver goodies to their particular district or state. So for example, Alan Lowenthal, who represents Long Beach in the U.S. House of Representatives, that he is going to be sitting on committees that will allow him to deliver goodies and things that matter to Long Beach. So, and you can take a look at this, that Alan Lowenthal is not on an agricultural committee because we don't have any farms in Long Beach, but he is on ones that deal with ports because the Port of LA and Long Beach are incredibly important. Ideas of transportation. Could also be on one dealing with higher education, things like that, because Cal State Long Beach is an important part of the city of Long Beach and the economic health and the political health of Long Beach. And so what happens is members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, are going to sit that deal with issues that matter to their district or to their state. And that allows them, when legislation comes through, is to think about not only what is the best legislation, but also what is this legislation going to do for my district or for my state? Can I find some federal funding to give to my district or to my state and the people of my district? The other thing is that the Congress very early on established for themselves things called franking privileges and free trips home. And those are things that are set up so that Congress is allowed to send free mail to their constituents. And it's not free, it's actually paid by the taxpayers. The first Postmaster General of the United States, Benjamin Franklin, came up with this and said, look, members of Congress need to be in contact with the people back home. And so one way of doing it is to say, look, we will use taxpayer money and use the postal system for members of Congress to send mailings to individuals, to their constituents in their state. But that's actually campaign ads. Really, I mean, it's a form of campaigning that is given for free to people who are incumbents. And so if they have that already, then they might be more successful. The other one is, again, that members of Congress need to be seen by their constituents. And so free trips are provided by the taxpayer, for that members of Congress are able to fly back to their district to find out what the interests are of the people in their district and their state. The other thing is that there are things called safe seats. There are certain seats that we know already who is going to win, whether it's a Democrat or Republican. Sometimes we don't know the name of that person. For an incumbent to be taken out during the primaries, it is possible for an incumbent to lose in the primary election. Even if it's a new and going to be representing that district or that state, the political party won't change because there are so many safe seats. And the House of Representatives, in fact, we know that there are only at most 52%, which is less than 12% of the 435 members of the House of Representatives. It could be as low, it's between 22 and 52 seats that are even considered competitive in the 2020 election. The rest of them, we know already the incumbent is going to win. We don't have to worry about it. There won't even be a surprise. And so it is very unlikely that there will be so much change in ways that people. And why is it that in the House of Representatives it is so likely that we know who is going to win a particular district? And that is because partisan state legislatures are responsible for drawing the district lines. And then they do it in such a way as to make sure that their party wins as many seats as possible. It's a process called gerrymandering. It's so important that we're going to be investigating that when we talk about Congress. We'll have videos talking about gerrymandering, why it exists, and what to do about that. But we see that in most states, these partisan legislators are drawing the district lines, and they do it in such a way as to make sure they get as many of their political party in office as possible. That is not true in California, and that's important. Part of this is a reminder that we have a different system here in California. In California, we have a redistricting board that is responsible for drawing the district lines for the House of Representatives, as well as for the state assembly and the state senate seats. And all of those, partisan group made up of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 who are independents or decline to state their political party. And every decision is made by majority rule of the commission. And that means it cannot be a partisan choice in terms of how the district lines are drawn. And so, in that sense, California is taking a different route than most states. There are other states that also have citizens redistricting boards, or they will have retired judges who will draw the district lines, or they'll have other ways in which you can take the decision about how the district lines are drawn, taken away from politicians, and to decrease the partisanship that drives most decisions in terms of how districts. The U.S. Senate can't have any district lines drawn because the lines for the Senate are the entire state. And you're not going to change the state boundaries between California and Nevada. Changed every 10 years, like the district lines have to be changed for the House of Representatives because the census demonstrates that people have moved from one part of California to another, have moved from California to other states, and vice versa. So the U.S. Senate doesn't have this gerrymandering possibility. And yet, demographics are for safe states for Democrats and safe states for Republicans. There are red states and blue states. The red states are places like Wyoming, Alabama, Texas, places like that, there are a clear sense that we know the U.S. Senate the U.S. senators from those states are going to be Republicans. Or there are clear blue states like California, Washington, New York, where the senators are going to be Democrats. And so we have an understanding of why both the House and the Senate, even though the House is the one that has this gerrymandering potential, is one in which, sorry about that, my nose is itching, is possible to have such safe seats. And really the final reason why incumbents are able is not surprising, and it leads as a nice linkage to the final reason of why, of what we know about who gets elected. Money. We're going to talk about that in detail when we talk about the role of money. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk about that. But we recognize just at the outset that if incumbents have more money, they have more resources to be able to have the campaign ads that most people use to figure out whether or not who they're going to vote for. Those campaign ads also create the potential for people to have more name recognition, for us to even have heard of the person who's running for office. And really what's hard to do, and courses can do this and research distinguish between these two, it's hard to distinguish between the power of incumbency and the power of money, because both are really powerful. Both those candidates who have the most money tend to win re-election at high rates. It is also true that incumbents win at high rates, but incumbents are also the ones who have a lot of money on hand. But the connection has logic, and it goes back to the idea of interest groups. Interest groups want something in return. They would like to have, if they're going to give money to a campaign, they're doing it not just because they're interested. They want it because they want to have an influence on and be able to point to, after the election, we gave money to your campaign, you got elected, you're protected there in Congress. And you're facing re-election in 2 years in the House of Representatives, 6 years in the U.S. Senate, for the President of the United States, if you want for future re-election campaigns, make sure you take care of the interests that got you there in the first place. And we're going to remind you of what those are. For the American Association of Retired Persons, for the National Rifle Association, if we are whatever interest group and we gave money to your campaign, we want to return our investment. And they're not going to try to give money to candidates who aren't going to win. And that's incumbents. And so it's this cycle that kind of points in the same direction, but there is an underlying logic to it.